I'm Rika Burnham, Head of Education at the Frick Collection, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the closing lecture for our extraordinarily beautiful special exhibition, Renoir, Impressionism, and Full-Length Painting. And it gives me even greater pleasure to introduce the speakers. Charlotte Hale, conservator in the Department of Paintings Conservation at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and Colin B. Bailey, Deputy Director, and Peter J. Sharp, Curator at the Frick Collection, and most importantly, Distinguished Curator of the Renoir exhibition, who conceived, organized, and brought to fruition one of the most important and groundbreaking exhibitions in the history of the Frick. Their jointly presented lecture today, Up and Down the Garden Path, Secrets of La Promenade Revealed, is the culmination of a year of collaborative study between a renowned curator and equally renowned conservator, and together they will take us into the Frick's great painting by Renoir, La Promenade, and beyond. Please join me in welcoming Colin Bailey and Charlotte Hale to the podium.
We feel we are channeling George and Gracie up here. And I will make my introductory remarks. Charlotte will make her remarks, and I will come back at the end. And we encourage you to see the exhibition after the lecture, and we will join you in the exhibition if there are any questions. Okay, thank you. In my opinion, focused exhibitions with a limited number of works make more of an impact. Renoir wrote these words to his dealer, Paul Durand-Ruel, in March 1902, long after the Promenade was painted. I found that overly large exhibitions of figures give the impression that they are easily produced, which takes away something of their cachet. The Impressionists have been reproached for exhibiting too often. People think they produce their paintings as easily as laying an egg. Well, the egg that inspired our exhibition of 9 paintings at the Frick is La Promenade, which Henry Clay Frick acquired in 1914 for the sum of $35,000. And there it is in Durand-Ruel's gallery in New York in 1914. $35,000 was a lot of francs, but it was a tenth of what Frick was paying for his old masters, his great old masters, and for his English 18th century paintings. Now, Frick was offered this picture, I think, as we'll see, because of its format, because of its relation to the tradition of Western European art. At the Frick collection, it occupied several spaces. Upstairs in the families area, at the top of the stairs. It did better going to the bottom of the stairs in much of the recent history. Many of you will remember seeing the Promenade, peeking through it, behind the organ and the great long case clock. In more recent years, we've brought her out into the light, and the painting has occupied the central spot in the oval room. This large figural composition, obviously made for public display, feels particularly at home in the Frick. And when you see the exhibition in the East Gallery, take a look back to the long vista, and you will see the beginning of this tradition with Piero della Francesca's St. John the Evangelist from the 1470s. In Western European art, the full-length format occupies a central and long-standing role. In the 16th century, we see in the Frick examples of mythological painting by Veronese. Of course, the format lends itself above all to portraiture of grand figures, both royal and aristocratic. And in the 18th century, Renoir's beloved 18th century, Gainsborough particularly, and Reynolds, used this format in their commissioned portraits. In modernist art, Manet and above all Whistler were artists who also cleaved to this full-length format. In this case, of course, Whistler is painting commissioned portraits. In Renoir's case, as we shall see, although there are identifiable sitters models not sitters, these are not portraits. None of the pictures in our exhibition were owned by the figures represented in them. Now, the scale the gravitas, the seriousness, the ambition of a painting like La Promenade comes as something as a shock, perhaps, to those of us who love Renoir and who are familiar with the Impressionists as artists who were painting small-scale, rapidly brushed, audaciously composed scenes of modern life, of everyday life, and of the landscape. Like Monet, Renoir's the co-founders of the Impressionist movement, Renoir and Monet startled Parisian circles in the 1870s with their impromptu, audacious, bravura transcriptions of modern life as it is felt and as it is lived. And to be absolutely clear, Monet and Renoir always signed their works to remind people at the time that these were finished paintings, not sketches. Impressionist pictures tend to be, as in Manet's work, impromptu, small scale, unexpected in their compositions, in their perspectives, in their viewpoints. They are rapidly brushed often, and above all, they are paintings made in plein air, in the open air, in daylight, and more importantly, communicating the experience of daylight as it is felt and seen. Renoir, whose nude we're seeing here, was of course the master of this tradition, and in his Impressionist pictures we still sense an extraordinarily virtuosic, bravura, audacious manner of putting paint on canvas, pure pigment, a high key and unexpected juxtapositions that give a feeling of life as it is led. In the 1860s and in the 1870s, however, Renoir was also a student at the Renoir had been a student at the École des Beaux-Arts, studying the official curriculum with the official teachers. And like all of the young Turks who would become the Impressionists, Renoir in the 1860s and early 70s made his presentation of his most important works at the Palais de l'Industrie, at the Salon, which after 1863 was held every year in Paris. The Salon deadline, the need, the opportunity to exhibit in public is crucial for understanding Renoir, and particularly this exhibition of his full-length formats. Artists were able to submit 2 works. They had to arrive in Paris to the officials at the Palais de l'Industrie between March 10 and March 20 every year. They would then be reviewed by members of the jury, top-hatted members who, with a wave of an umbrella, could determine whether a picture was to be exhibited or to be refused. And here are the many unlucky exhibitors with the refusé stamp on the back of their canvas. The challenge and the prize was to be able to show your work in the Palais de l'Industrie for 6 weeks, where as many as 500,000 visitors came to see the latest in the contemporary art world. Far more people than you will find at the Whitney Biennale today, looking at the latest in modern art in New York. This was a huge public attraction, and for Renoir and his future Impressionists, it was crucial to exhibit and to succeed in the Salon. Renoir had a checkered history with his full-length pictures in the decade before the Impressionist Revolution. In 1866, he exhibited this full-length double picture, Bathers in a Landscape. We see it in a portrait of Basile's studio. The picture, in fact, was cut down after it was refused at the Salon. Renoir is shown on the right painting this work on a canvas that is clearly considerably taller than he is. He's even having to stand on a little stool to get to the top. After being refused at the Salon, he continued to work in this format every year. The Cabaret of Mother Antony, painted in 1866, a format 120 figure, a standard size canvas. The next year, Renoir paints his Diana the Huntress, today in the National Gallery in Washington, which he submits to the Salon of 1867. The picture is refused, and Renoir recounted later in life that he was tempted by an offer to cut up his picture because someone wanted to buy simply the still life of the deer. But happily for us, he held back, and the picture now is in the National Gallery in Washington. full-length format and also the grand horizontal format. These are the two public exhibition standard sizes that Renoir works on every year, often in more than one example, in order to show his latest work at the Salon. This painted in 1867, the panorama of the Universal Exhibition, and his first success in the genre in the Salon, painted in 1867, signed and dated 1867, for the Salon of 1868. Lise with a Parasol, today in the Folkwang Museum in Essen in Germany. This is an example of painting large in the newly enfranchised manner, and it was accepted at the Salon, it was reviewed by the Salon critics, it even received the honors of a caricature. Here we have Lise as a camembert with her parasol in the forest. This was all good, this was very good. Sadly for Renoir, he would not sell the picture for 5 years. He continues right through until 1872 to paint large pictures. None is larger than riding in the Bois de Boulogne, today in the Kunsthalle in Hamburg, and this Renoir worked on over the winter of 1872-3 in a rented studio in the École Militaire. Such a large canvas was probably too large for his own studio. He submitted it to the Salon of 1873. It was refused. He showed it at the Salon des Refusés of that year, and finally, after the indignities of rejection, he joined forces with his great friend Claude Monet, and between them, the two artists, along with Degas and Pissarro, established the Impressionist exhibitions held outside of the Salon, held at a time when if you were showing with the Impressionists, you simply could not show at the Salon. It was an important breakaway movement. And the first exhibition was held in Nadar's studio on the Rue des Capucines on 2 floors with these wonderful full-scale windows in which light permeated as it might in an apartment or in a residence, unlike the cavernous rooms at the Palais de l'Industrie. In the first Impressionist exhibition of 1874, Renoir showed 7 pictures, but 2 of them remained the full-length format that he had worked on in the previous decade. The Parisienne from Cardiff, the Dancer from the National Gallery, both painted very similarly, both in our exhibition next door. At the same time, Renoir also painted one of his most beloved pictures of a smaller format, the beautiful La Loge in the Courtauld Galleries in London, where, as you can tell even in the slide, the painting is more concentrated, the work is more deeply impasted, it's a little more, there's a little bit more gravitas in the handling. It was this format, the full-length format, using models that might be friends or paid-for models, that Renoir continued to work through in the 1870s. The model of La Parisienne, different from the young girl who posed as a ballet dancer, reappears, Mademoiselle Henriot reappears as the page in the Columbus Museum's Madame Henriot en travesti. Look at her face and her hair, and I would suggest that she also was the model for Renoir's La Promenade. Renoir chose to work in series, if you like, and between 1874 and 1877, Mademoiselle Henriot was his model of choice. Renoir is on the other, although Renoir required the presence of the model before him, and he was deeply he was close to and fond of Mademoiselle Henriot. In fact, this was the single painting of her by Renoir that she owned, a painting so beautiful that in the 1960s, Elizabeth Arden used it for a... Renoir needed thousands of brushworks to create a beautiful face. You'll need only a few with Elizabeth Arden's new color veil. So beautiful was this picture. Renoir was also, like the great realist writers, Zola, Maupassant, Renoir is a maker of stories, of fictions, because when we look to Mademoiselle Henriot herself, we see someone of a rather less alluring appearance. The Promenade, Renoir's Promenade was his major submission to the second Impressionist exhibition of 1876, which took place in April of 1876. It was the centerpiece of his installation. He had great hopes for it, and he was disappointed in the critical response. A kindly reaction was Maurice Chaumelin's. Monsieur Renoir lavishes attention on his figures and nearly always takes the trouble to finish them, but he is less good at indicating the setting that these figures inhabit. In his large painting entitled La Promenade, I see a young mother urging on her two pretty little daughters. I take a great interest in these gracious characters, but I am terrified that the ground is about to give way from beneath their feet. This touches upon the radical and unexpected nature of Renoir's style, his handling, his color, his composition, his use of impasto, and his color tonalities. None of these would strike us today as in any way subversive, transgressive, or indeed uncomfortable. But the response to La Promenade in 1876 was precisely that. And we read from Arthur Bagnères, in some ways, the most damning review of this picture. He wrote, "Renoir's figures are little more than imperceptible clouds. From far off, one sees a bluish fog, from which 6 chocolate pastils forcefully emerge. What can this be? As one gets closer, one realizes that these pastils are the eyes of 3 people, and the fog a mother and her young daughters. I prefer Monsieur Ingres's portrait of Monsieur Bertin." Now, the whole project of our exhibition next door was inspired by understanding this picture better, understanding this format better, situating Renoir and the Impressionists as a whole between the 1870s and early 80s in a tradition that takes account both of the background in Western European painting and also in contemporary norms and expectations in this period. And for an artist as beloved, as much reproduced, as often seen as Renoir, we were excited and delighted at some of the discoveries that were made. None of the discoveries were as interesting as the ones that were made at the Met. And with Charlotte Hale, the research and examination of La Promenade has led to insights that have completely changed our understanding of this picture.
It was a wonderful experience, as you can imagine, having this painting in our studio for a few weeks. The technical examination did reveal some unexpected and illuminating information. But before getting to that, I'd like to set the stage by talking about the materials that Renoir used to paint the picture and his painting technique, and how these relate to other painters of the Impressionist circle. La Promenade was painted on a single piece of finely woven canvas. For the great majority of his smaller pictures, Renoir used readily available standard size formats, but for La Promenade and other large-scale canvases, he probably did as his son, the director, Jean Renoir, later described, which was to cut a piece from a roll of canvas and fasten it to a board with drawing pins, mounting it later on a stretcher. In common with the other Impressionist painters, Renoir purchased his canvas, paints, and other materials from specialized color merchants whose numbers proliferated in the later 18th and 19th centuries, along with the range of products available. We can sometimes get valuable information about where and when a picture was painted from the reverse, like the names and addresses of the colorman who supplied the canvas. Though La Promenade has been lined, that is, the original canvas was strengthened by backing it with a second canvas, the liner fortunately transcribed the stamp on the reverse of the original, identifying the supplier as Alexis Ottoz. The stamp probably looked like this. This comes from the back of a painting by Boudin. The Ottoz were a dynasty of Parisian colormen that started with Ange Ottoz, who opened a shop in the Rue de la Michaudière in 1827. Alexis was one of Ange's sons, who ran a store at 46 Rue Notre-Dame de Lorette, close to Renoir's studio in the Rue Saint-Georges, between 1867 and 74. At that time, Alexis began to deal in contemporary art, and he seems to have stopped trading at this address in 1876, shortly after the picture was painted. At the theatre, a painting now in the National Gallery, London, is also on a canvas that came from Alexis. This slide shows workers at Lefranc and Bourgeois, photographed around 30 years ago, sizing on the left and priming on the right, large stretched canvases in the same way they would have been made in Renoir's time. The prepared canvases would have been cut up for sale as rolls already mounted on stretchers. Renoir usually bought his canvas commercially pre-primed with a layer of lead, white, and chalk in oil, and then in the studio added a second priming made of lead white mixed with 1/3 linseed oil and 2/3 turpentine. On the right is the X-ray of La Promenade. Essentially, this image maps the distribution of lead white paint, a high molecular weight pigment. As lead white was used to prime the canvas, all we can read of the overlying paint layers are the thickly applied lead white highlights, but we can just make out the broad, irregular sweeps of the lead white priming applied with a palette knife by the artist. Renoir's preference for smooth, impermeable white primings seems to go back to his early training. He was born in Limoges and moved to Paris with his family as a young child. At 13, he was apprenticed as a porcelain painter, making copies of Sèvres ware stamped as such for the Asian market. This is a clock made by the pottery Lévi Frère on the Rue du Temple, where he worked. He later described the work as painting little bouquets on white backgrounds, for larger pieces, larger bouquets, and how in his midday break, he would run to the galleries at the Louvre to sketch. When the pottery closed because of the increasing popularity of cheaper machine-made ceramics, Renoir began decorating fans with copies of French 18th century paintings. At 18, he was apprenticed to a manufacturer of blinds for export to church missions, producing paintings on calico that served in place of more expensive stained glass windows. He later said he found it not unlike other forms of painting. All you had to do was add a certain quantity of turpentine to the color. All this took place before he decided to learn serious painting by entering the studio of Charles Clair, where he met Monet, Sisley, and Basile, and enrolling at the École des Beaux-Arts. In the 1860s, like many artists, he painted out of doors in the forest of Fontainebleau, influenced strongly by the Barbizon painters Diaz and Corot. But it was his friend Monet who helped open up his palette. In these paintings of 1869, Renoir on the left, Monet on the right, the two were painting side by side at the watering place of La Grenouillère on the Seine, close to Paris. Renoir's technique changed a great deal during his long working life, but without question, his early experiences in the decorative arts informed his painting technique, particularly in the 1860s and 70s. And perhaps it's not insignificant that he continued to wear a porcelain painter's smock when he painted. The richly colored translucency that Renoir achieved in his early paintings, here we're looking at details from his portrait of Madame Bernier at the Met, came from the combined effect of his smooth, white, dare I say, porcelain-like primings and his use of glazes or semi-glazes, translucent colors and colors diluted with additional oil and turpentine that allowed the priming to reflect through, not so different from painting on porcelain, blinds, or fans where light is coming through from behind. Renoir was not a typical Impressionist in that in his early years, certainly at the time of painting La Promenade, he liked his colors both pure and saturated. Part of his coloristic brilliance came from using paint directly from the tube, not pre-mixed on his palette, and then mixing colors together on the canvas. He made only selective use of adding white to his colors, which was the way that artists like Monet and Sisley habitually gave luminosity to their paintings. And unlike other Impressionists, Renoir consistently added saturation to his paintings by varnishing them or having his dealers varnish before sale or exhibition. From his early experiences in the decorative arts, he knew that it was essential to paint with precision and keep his colors pure and unmuddied. Jean Renoir said, my father was very meticulous about everything that had to do with his profession. His palette was clean as a new coin. It was square and fitted neatly into the cover of his paint box. Into one of his double paint saucers, he poured linseed oil, and into the other, a mixture of linseed oil and turpentine in equal proportions. On a low table at the side of his easel, he had a glass full of turpentine, in which he almost invariably cleaned his brush after applying color. His fastidious approach went hand in hand with a great respect for craftsmanship. Late in life, he sagely told his dealer, Vollard, the ancients were able to produce that marvelous surface and those limpid colors, the secret to which we're still hunting for, because they had a thorough knowledge of their craft. He pored over Cennino Cennini's treatise on painting techniques, Il Libro dell'Arte, written around 1400 in Florence, and in 1909 he wrote the preface to the 50th anniversary edition of the French translation. Though artists' paints were produced on an industrial scale by the 1870s, Renoir, as well as Monet, Morisot, and Sisley, favored traditionally hand-ground paints. He probably bought his paints for La Promenade from Julien Père-Tanguy, the colorman and dealer who showed and supported a number of Impressionist and post-Impressionist painters. This is a portrait of him by Van Gogh. The success that came to Renoir with his Madame Charpentier and her children, painted for the Salon of 1878, meant that he was able to buy the more expensive hand-ground paints made by Moulard, considered the best in Paris. The color that dominates the spectacular gallery next door is blue, specifically cobalt blue. Cobalt blue had been available as an artist's pigment since the early 19th century and became a staple for Renoir and other Impressionist painters. Cobalt was the blue pigment that he favored in his early paintings, and in La Promenade it was used for the deep blue jacket or paletot of the young woman. On the right is an autograph list of pigments from shortly after La Promenade was painted. As you see, Renoir also made use of other new pigments that came on the market in the 19th century, which broadened the Impressionist palettes considerably, including chrome yellow, viridian, emerald green, and synthetic ultramarine. While other Impressionists considered black a non-color that should be excluded from the palette, except for a period in the 1880s, Renoir embraced it. However, he used it very judiciously as a specific accent or compositional feature, as in the spectacular dress in La Loge. Late in life, recalling Velázquez, he said, "His blacks are magnificent. The older I grow, the more I love black. You break your neck trying to find the right color, then you put in a little touch of ivory black, and there you are." In La Promenade, pure black is used for one of the little dogs and in the doll's jacket. It's also used in the eyes. The use of black in an otherwise very colorful painting gives the eyes a deliberate intensity, though this aspect of the painting was ridiculed by critics, as we've heard. As you see, black is actually used as one of many colors in the eyes: blue, white, red lake, and yellow. Renoir maintained a high chroma in his paintings through skillful manipulation of pigments, as here, painting the division between the lips with a line of blue, adding red lake to the cobalt blue in the shadows of the blue paletot. And in the little girl's outfits, using viridian or emerald green for the shadows, adding increasing quantities of white for the midtones, and using a slightly different color, cobalt blue and white, for the highlights. Though hand-ground, Renoir's paints would have been purchased in tubes. The collapsible metal paint tube was invented in 1841, replacing the traditional storage in the much less reliable pig's bladders. You see some of these on the left. With the advent of tube paints, painting out of doors, fundamental for the Impressionists, was made infinitely easier. This is Renoir's painting of Monet at work in his garden. Jean Renoir quoted his father as saying, "Without paint in tubes, there would have been no Cézanne, no Monet, no Sisley or Pissarro, nothing of what journalists were later to call Impressionism." In addition to the convenience factor, the more bodied consistency of tube paint was a distinctive feature of Impressionist paintings. Stiff, brushy handling characterized the paintings of Monet and Sisley. For Renoir, the use of brushy impasto was just one arrow in his quiver. More than any other Impressionist painter, especially in his early years, his handling varied enormously across the canvas, creating a range of seductive effects, drawing the eye here and there. Here in the hat, he uses thick paint that he applies with a variety of strokes, worked wet in wet. You see the color of one stroke pulled into the next, and ending with blobs of pure lead white impasto. He juxtaposes medium-rich translucent colors, deep blues, purples, crimsons, and leaf greens, with leaner, opaque colors mixed with white or pure white. Look at the range of handling in this one detail. In addition to the virtuoso treatment of the hat, executed with highly visible strokes made with flat-ended bristle brushes, like that pictured at the bottom of his list of materials, there is the delicate modeling of the face done with small marten hair sable brushes and blended so that the individual strokes are barely visible. The fine details of the features, down to the eyelashes, are done with an even more delicate touch. The hair is painted with a cascade of feathery strokes. Meanwhile, the background comprises a web of broad, multi-directional strokes that are drier and leaner. They skip over the surface, hitting only the tops of the canvas weave or the strokes beneath. This range of handling across the canvas was how Renoir, always very much a figure painter, reconciled the depiction of flesh and the details of facial features with the more broken brushwork that characterized the Impressionist idiom. Likewise, in contrast to the carefully painted face of the little girl, the face of her doll, executed wet in wet, has a rawness and modernity that's almost shocking by comparison. The background is much more thinly painted with multi-directional dabs and flicks. Note particularly the bold splotches of green in the otherwise empty flower bed on the right. And the figure group in the background is painted with tremendous bravura, giving the impression of lively action and conversation. Gossiping women, Wrigley toddler, and the snuffling little black and white dogs, which would be unintelligible as such were it not for the context. Recalling Velázquez later in life, Renoir said, "Only a painter who knows his business thoroughly can create the impression that a picture was done at one stroke. His work looks so easy, but think of the experimentation it must have taken." Spontaneity, signaled by visible brushwork, is a hallmark of the early years of Impressionism. In contrast to the slick, finished surfaces of the academic mainstream, it signified the modernity of the paintings, along with scenes of contemporary life, popular locations, and absolutely up-to-the-minute fashions. But Impressionist paintings are seldom as spontaneous and direct as they appear. This early work by Renoir from the Met gives the appearance of having been dashed off in a single sitting. I was surprised when, during the course of treating this painting recently, it became evident that it had been reworked over a period of time. The sky was completely repainted, and a tree on the horizon that's visible in the X-ray was painted out. X-ray and infrared imaging of At the Theatre, painted shortly after La Promenade, revealed a significant change in its composition. We can see two additional figures to the left of the young girl. The shape of the man's head and his white collar are fairly clear. The features of his female companion are a little harder to read. They seem to have been sitting in the row in front of the girl and her chaperone. Renoir decided to eliminate these two figures and focus the composition instead on the nervous and expectant young girl, which he did to great effect. The painting acquired the popular title of La Première Sortie, the first outing. Technical examination of La Promenade also revealed some significant changes that alter both the composition and our understanding of the scene depicted. Using an infrared camera allows us to see through the overlying paint layers to beneath the surface. The infrared image reveals that Renoir's initial conception of the painting was rather different. On the left of the canvas, behind the main figure group, are two additional figures. On the far left is an elegant woman shown full length, wearing a hat known as a toque, with a veil, holding a muff. Next to her is another woman wearing a white cap with a white bow at her neckline. An infrared detail shows the features of the first woman quite distinctly, as well as the spots on her veil, a so-called voilette mouchetée, mouche being French for fly, with spots as big as flies. We see the same type of veil in Renoir's picture of a young woman painted at the same time. Having seen the voilette mouchetée in the infrared image, it was easier to discern, within the lively brushwork of the small figure group, the same type of veil on one of the women chatting. The partially hidden face of the figure behind the veiled woman is a little harder to make out, though her eyes and hairline are clear. Remember that we're seeing this figure beneath the paint surface and that many of the paint strokes that you see in the infrared image are from the overlying paint of the background that was used to block them out. This X-ray of the same detail doesn't help flesh out the original appearance of these women very well, since it essentially records only the presence of lead white paint. What we can see here are the white cap, the frilly collar, and the bow of the second woman. Examination of the picture surface using a microscope allowed us to establish the colors of the hidden women's clothing. At the bottom is a photograph taken down the microscope of an area in the upper left. You can see the black paint of the veiled woman's toque through the overlying greenery. Her paletot was also black. In the location of the second figure, beneath the background paint, we can see a brighter blue. In this case, Silvia Centeno of the Department of Scientific Research at the Met undertook analysis to try to determine what type of blue it is. It turns out to be cobalt. Cobalt was also identified in the bright blue of the ribbons of the hat of the nursemaid holding a baby in the upper right, who also wears a white cap. Additionally, between this figure and the young woman, there's a white form that was also painted out. It's impossible to say what it is, but it's tempting to read it as the hood of a perambulator or baby blanket. If anyone has other ideas about this, do come up and tell us after the lecture.
So now we can think a little bit about how Renoir conceived originally his composition and the difference between the title of La Promenade that he gave it and the title of Mother and Children that Mr. Frick acquired the picture as and that you see on the frame to this day. Let's focus to begin with on the fashions. We are clearly looking at a picture made in the depths of winter. The girls are all wearing fashionable winter costumes. The trimming is fur or cashmere or perhaps swansdown. And when we look at some of the fashion plates of the time, we can see exactly the same type of apparel and the same prominence given to the fur lining. In this picture of a mother receiving of a mother and daughter being received in a very glamorous, fancy interior. We see the little girl with her matching toque, cuffs, muff, and costume, exactly the same as Renoir paints them. This fashion plate dates to the very same year. And remembering that Renoir is part of a larger community of artists, when we look at some of the fashionable, more academically trained painters who were much more successful in their day than Renoir, we see in Firmin Girard's The Godmother's Garden exactly the same type of scenario. The young girl dressed in fur, ruff, matching ruff, in the most elaborate costume. Jean Béraud, in a painting made the year after Renoir, The Church of Saint-Philippe de Roule, shows us again the very fashionable dress of these very wealthy and well-to-do parishioners of the Church of Saint-Philippe du Roule. So Renoir's picture suggests a type of society, a wealthy, well-to-do, glamorous, fashionable society. Where is this glamorous society promenading? Renoir doesn't give us a great deal of information, but he gives us some. I would speculate that we are seeing the three characters on their stroll, their winter stroll, in the Parc Monceau in Paris, in the fashionable part of Paris, a park inaugurated in 1861 during Baron Haussmann's modernization of the city, and a park in which le beau monde, particularly mothers, nannies, and children, congregated. Zola writes about the on-the-rise Saccard family in La Curée as building a mansion near the Parc Monceau because it was such a fashionable place to be. And looking at Renoir's hibernal winter picture, we can compare it to Monet's wonderful sunlit painting of the Parc Monceau, painted in 1878, which shows the park, the promenade, the characters. It gives much more information of the houses, the new mansions behind. But I'd suggest to you that we are dealing with summer and winter in the same site. And I'm showing you the background detail of Renoir's promenade. Is Renoir painting a portrait, or is he painting a figure painting, a genre painting? The models for the girls, they seem so clearly a pair of real sisters. And in the curatorial records at the Frick, many years ago, my predecessor received a letter from the descendants of these, or the claimed descendants of the Salvatelli family, who sent us photographs of her ancestors. And these two little girls were sisters. They were the daughters of a Luigi Salvatelli, who was a director of a carriage rental business in Paris, and his wife and her two daughters would promenade in the fashionable areas around the Parc Monceau, and indeed recalled meeting Renoir in the Place de la Trinité, in the Square de la Trinité, another fashionable site that Renoir painted. They claimed that Suzanne and Marguerite, the daughters, Renoir decided to ask the mother if he could if he could use them as models for a picture he was working on. As was entirely correct, their mother demurred to be a model for Renoir, even though apparently he invited her back, as it were, to see his etchings, and she refused to do so. So we have a sense that the promenade, the girls at least, may well be modeled after actual people. I've suggested to you previously that the main figure here is perhaps modeled by Mademoiselle Henriot, so it's an amalgam. What world are we in? We're in a world actually of we're in a world of nannies, mothers, children. The relationship between the principal figure and these two girls was never entirely clear. Unlike Degas, who paints Vicomte Lepic striding across the Place de la Concorde with his two daughters and their bourgeois in an empty Place de la Concorde, no question about the relationship between Degas' sitters. Unlike Degas' painting, which was made after Renoir's, the relationship of these three characters is less clear. although we are instinctively drawn to call it La Mother and Children, and indeed when Renoir sold the picture finally in 1891, it was entitled Jeune Mère et Enfants, Young Mother and Children. Despite that, we are actually in a different world. We're in the world of mummies, babies, and nurses, as the title of this fashion illustration shows us, drawn from La Vie Parisienne for 1878. This shows a series of vignettes in the popular press about taking a morning or afternoon promenade in the Champs-Élysées. And I draw your attention to two vignettes. Here, a detail showing fashionably dressed nursemaids or governesses. And the legend reads, "These spoilt nurses, they have no intention of returning to the country. They'd rather parade around in lace-trimmed aprons and wear bonnets with flattering ribbons." And on the right, another detail, this time mother and baby, maman et bébé. The mother is so proud of her 4-year-old, the 4-year-old's otter-skinned hat, his leather gaiters, and his fur coat that makes him look just like a Russian boyar. Now, I draw your attention, too, to this detail of the voilette mouchetée, even in this little vignette, and the very elegant trappings of the nursemaids, but not quite as elegant as the mother. We were very worried about the so-called mother's hair, to be honest. Whereas the girls show their long tresses beautifully, the idea that a mother might be seen in public wearing such long hair undressed was completely counter to all norms of social behavior in the 1870s right through to the end of the century. And I must say, in talking about this picture to many people, I've certainly seen some, I would say women rather than men, react to how this could not possibly be a mother because of her hair. Married women were only able to be seen in public with their hair up. And so we began to look at what evidence we might have to help us confirm this identity. And we came across an illustration from about the same period it was called Tablier d'école, aprons for the school. And it shows a simple gathered skirt on this young girl, a sister, taking her sisters to school. And that skirt can be seen again, I think, in the promenade. It's a very similar costume, and although the hair is much more luxuriant in Renoir's, this girl too is able to appear in public with her hair down. So we have a sense now of the main character in the promenade, as a protective older sister chaperoning her 2 younger charges. It's a trope, it's an idea, it's an image that Renoir could have seen earlier in Manet's great painting At the Railroad, where again an older sister accompanies her younger sister outside of the Gare Saint-Lazare, and the fact that the older sister, so demure, so proper, so sweet with the dog, was modeled for by Victorine Meurant, the model for Olympia, would have given just a frisson to this picture. Of course, in some ways, the determining proof, if you like, of the relationship of these 3 figures came when we had Charlotte's infrared reflectography and the evidence of what would now appear to be the elegant matron dressed in her voilette mouchetée, accompanied by a lesser gouvernante, servant, nanny, watching her 3 offspring promenade through the Parc Monceau. Now, another set of very interesting images that helped confirm this came to my attention long after the catalogue for this exhibition was put to bed. And I enjoyed seeing in both Amsterdam and Washington the fascinating exhibition Snapshot Painters and Photography Vuillard to Bonnard that was organized by Elizabeth Easton, and which is now wending its way from Washington to Indianapolis. In this fascinating exhibition, we saw photographs by a number of late 19th century artists, but I'm showing you here some works by Henri Evenepoel, who was a Belgian painter who studied in Paris with Gustave Moreau in the 1890s. And I'm showing you one of his signature pictures, the woman with called the Chapeau Blanc. And more importantly, Evenepoel's Snapshot of himself, a self-portrait in a three-way mirror, showing him using this new tool, the Kodak, almost the equivalent of an Instamatic camera in 1898. Now, Evenepoel started using this camera in 1897 and made a series of views from the Place de la Concorde that were done in the autumn of 1898, so 20 years after Renoir's picture was made. We see his cousin and his mistress, Louise van Mattenberg, here, promenading across the Place de la Concorde with her two young daughters and a son fathered by Evenepoel from a different father, promenading across the Place de la Concorde with a governess just visible on the right. The little girls in matching outfits have wonderfully long hair, left loose, and like her daughters, Louise is wearing a similarly formal outfit with a similar hat. She's also wearing the same voilette mouchetée that we have seen in Renoir's women and in the mother that he painted out of our picture. And the governess, again, is just hardly visible. You see here exactly this type of costume which is so important as a signifier of class. The governess, as is entirely appropriate, out for her afternoon stroll, is not protected by a voilette mouchetée, and she's wearing a much less elaborate costume. The sartorial codes in the second half of the 19th century in Paris served to identify rank, status, and class. These potentially divisive, even antagonistic elements are softened by the photographer's lens, but they are all but obliterated in Renoir's utopian passeggiata. The purpose of painting, Renoir wrote, is to decorate the walls, and so it has to be as rich as possible. Since we are now obliged to paint easel paintings, for me a picture has to be something pleasant, joyful, and pretty. Yes, pretty. And I am fully aware that it is difficult to accept that a painting can be a great work of art while remaining joyful. Because Fragonard-smiled people have been quick to say that he is a minor painter. They don't take people who smile seriously. We do, and I encourage you to take Renoir seriously and visit the exhibition in the East Gallery. Thank you.